Welcome back everyone. In today's video I'm finally getting back into Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. We're now onto the 6th book, The Vampire Armand, published in 1998. Like with Men Not the Devil, The Vampire Armand is a divisive book among fans, with some people criticising its erotic content and other people criticising the religious diatribes that Rice goes on in this book. For me, with this one, I did find some sympathy with some of those critiques, others I disagree with, and we'll get into why. But overall, I did actually enjoy this book, probably a little bit better than I enjoyed Men Not the Devil, so I think it's still a solid entry in the series, even if it does have a couple of flaws. Part 1. Summary. After the events of Men Not the Devil, Lestat still lies in a self-induced coma. It is revealed, however, that the Vampire Armand, who seemed to die at the end of the previous book, survived his walk into the sun, and he has come to see Lestat in his slumber. While there, he is encouraged by David Talbot to tell the story of his vampiric and human life. Armand's story begins somewhere in the late 15th century in Kievan Rus, where he worked as an icon painter at a monastery. Armand is soon kidnapped from the monastery and sold by slave traders into a brothel, where he is rescued by the ancient vampire Marius de Romanus. The Vampire Armand tells the story of his life as a human alongside Marius, then their lives together as vampires, before taking us all the way up to the present day. Ultimately, Armand reveals his deep struggles with his religious beliefs, which ultimately caused him to walk into the sunlight at the end of Men Not the Devil. Part 2. The Vampire Armand. Okay, so let's start the review by focusing on the positive stuff. So the thing that I enjoyed the most about this book was the Vampire Armand himself. That was the biggest draw for me. In previous books, Armand has always been somewhat of an enigma. We've always been sort of not really sure who he is or what his motivations are, and he has also appeared to be a villain in many of the books. In Interview with the Vampire, he comes across as one of the main villains of the story, him being linked to the death of Claudia. And then in The Vampire Lestat, when he resurfaces, he comes across as a spoiled, narcissistic little brat that really doesn't have many redeeming qualities to him. Now, at the end of The Vampire Armand, Armand still has these qualities. He is still a bit selfish, he's still a bit narcissistic, he's very caught up in his own pain, if you like, and these things are all still there. But what is good is that by the end of the book, you as a reader feel a lot more sympathy for Armand because you understand his history and his psychology and the things that make him tick. So what you end up with at the end of the book is a much more complex and interesting character than the more mysterious villain character that we saw in previous books. I know that by the end of this story, I actually found a new appreciation for Armand, and of all the vampires, even though Louis always gets described as the most human one, I feel like Armand is actually more human than any of the other vampires, and he also has a more centered moral compass, really, when it comes to things like killing and being a vampire and his place in the world. So The Vampire Armand is, to me, very similar to Interview with the Vampire. It's a story that's focused on one character's journey through their vampire life. But it's also very different from Interview with the Vampire in a lot of ways. It seems to me that with Interview with the Vampire, as I talked about in my video, that book was really trying to explore what it is to be a vampire, what it is to be that kind of creature going through an existence that's quite lonely and having regrets and having companions and these relationships like with Claudia and Lestat and Louis that go terribly. And all these things still appear in The Vampire Armand. But for me, this book really felt like some kind of coming-of-age story. I think part of this is because we spend a lot of time with Armand as a human, and he's quite young. He's 17, I think, when he's turned into a vampire, and we also spend some time with him before. And Armand's story is very much a story of a vampire who is perpetually immature. Armand is always kind of seeking approval from others, whether it's Marius, or then later on with Lestat and Louis. He's always looking up to someone, he's always trying to follow someone and be with someone. But by the end of the book, we see this starting to change. Armand starts the story as a pupil of Marius, and Marius and Armand's relationship is basically the centre of the book. It takes up a big part of it. And throughout all that relationship, we just have Armand struggling to assert himself over Marius, who is very much trying to mould Armand into the creature that he wants him to be. And by the end of the book, we see Armand moving away from this, to the point where he actually takes on two protégés of his own, human protégés, two young children. It's called Sybil and Benji. So by the end of the novel, we actually get Armand almost becoming a version of Marius himself, although I would say a more respectful version of Marius, because he is much kinder to his children than Marius was to him. And so that for me was what the book was essentially doing, or the big character arc for Armand in this book, was this growth from a immature character who is selfish and kind of spoilt, and him moving away from that and becoming someone who is his own person, and he's able to not have to, please Marius or please someone else in order to be happy. Now, because I saw the story in this way, I think that helps me really appreciate the stuff in the story that takes place after the events of Men Not Your Devil. Most of the book does focus on Armand's past, with his relationship with Marius, and then also his run-ins with Lestat and Louis from the previous books in the series. And I think for a lot of people that would be where the interest lies in the book. We want to hear where Armand has come from. We want to hear his side of the story with respect to Louis and Lestat. And all that stuff is really interesting. But I think it was a really good decision for Rice to actually have this modern segment that focuses on something else. And I think this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, a lot of Armand's story has already been covered in previous books. And so if you just had the book focusing on this history stuff, there would be a lot of, retreading of ground. And Rice even self-awarely mentions this when she deals with the stuff from Interview the Vampire or the Vampire Lestat. Armand is very quick in covering those bits, because she recognises that while it might be interesting to get a bit of perspective from Armand on these events, it also might just be, it's not something that's massively interesting, given that as a reader you already know the plot, so why would you care to read about the same thing you've already read? So that's the first reason why I think it was good to have this modern plot, just to give us readers something new at the end. The second reason why I think it was a good thing is because it allows Armand to have this character growth that I've been talking about. It's this final part where we see Armand change as a character and become something different. And if this wasn't there, then we just have Armand as he was and as we knew him in his history, telling his story, and then stopping with him just being exactly the same as he was in the previous book. So I think actually it's a great thing to have this segment at the end, which is funny because again it's something that a lot of people criticize about the book. They don't really care about this stuff at the end. But actually I think it makes a lot of sense because it gives Armand the chance to grow as a character and become something else. I also think that the final part of this book, which I won't spoil but I will say, is really poignant and really happy. In fact, I would say that minus some tensions that are still present at the end of the book, this is probably one of the happiest or more uplifting books in the series. It's not as doom and gloom as something like Interview the Vampire, which was just this, black hole of misery. It's not as action-packed as something like the end of Queen of the Damned or the suspense of the end of the Vampire Lestat. It just has a really nice poignancy to it, and you feel like Armand has progressed as a character in a really positive way at the end of the book. So I really liked that. I thought that the book came together structurally really well. I thought that Armand's character work was really good, and it felt like we finally got to see a full character rather than just this, mysterious enigma, which is what he was for me in previous books. Part 3. An erotic fantasy. So, all of the books in the Vampire Chronicles have this undertone of sexuality in them, and as they have progressed, there have been more explicit sexual things going on, especially in things like The Body Thief and Men Want the Devil, but usually it's kept to a minimum, and it's all more subtext. Now that's not the case in the Vampire Armand, which sees all of that subtext in previous books come to the fore, and especially the homoerotic subtext is now no longer a subtext. You have Armand as a human having lots of sex with lots of men, but also women, and that covers a big portion of the earlier parts of the book. Now, this is one of the things that is contentious among reviews that I've read about the Vampire Armand. A lot of people don't seem to like the amount of sex that occurs in this book, and in particular, they seem to care about the homosexual stuff rather than just the sexual stuff in general. Now, to be honest, I don't really care for these kinds of criticisms, especially the criticisms that only seem to be focusing on the fact that there's homosexual sex in this book. Now, fair enough if you just don't really like sex implicit in books, you prefer things to be, brushed under the carpet or not really focused on too much, fine, that's fine. But if you're just moaning because it's got sex that's not what you would prefer to see in a book I don't think that's really a valid criticism of the book. That being said, there is one criticism that I think might be considered to be valid, and that's that some people say that it seems like Rice is going for shock value with this book, because there's so much of it, and a lot of it is in the BDSM kind of sex. So it's all pretty explicit, it's all pretty shocking, and so people think it's just there for shock value rather than to enhance the narrative. Now, to those people, I think there's an interesting discussion to be had, because I actually think that the BDSM stuff that Rice does in this book actually plays an important role in the story overall. In fact, I think the kind of BDSM relationship between Armand and Marius, which is, again, where that kind of stuff is really focused on, is actually reflecting the story that she's actually telling. Now, we can see in the relationship with Marius and Armand that Marius is meant to be this mentor, this guiding force that's meant to be shaping Armand to eventually become a vampire. Now, Armand is somewhat enthralled by Marius, you know, he's in love with him and all that kind of stuff, but at the same time, he is somewhat of a brat. He's always questioning some of Marius's things, you know, like sometimes Marius will say, you need to learn this, and Armand will be like, why? I don't care about this. And so you have this tension there between pupil and teacher. And to me, that's then reflected in the BDSM sex stuff, because what we have there is a relationship where Marius is using force to physically abuse or berate or impose himself on Armand. And Armand, somewhat liking this, but also being resistant to it, is just a reflection of what's happening in their relationship. And I think that's really clever, and it's something that Rice has also done in some of her more explicitly erotic work, the Sleeping Beauty Quintet. In those books, again, she's using sex, and BDSM in particular, to illustrate points, in that case about fairy tales, but in this case, it's about this student-teacher relationship. She's reflecting that in their sexual practices. And I think that's really cool. I think that's a really smart way to incorporate that kind of stuff into your book. And it just goes to show that she's not doing it for shock value, she's doing it to do something interesting. Now, all that said, some people just don't like that kind of stuff in books, and that's fine. You know, if you don't want to read about it, then you're probably not going to enjoy this book very much. But if you can get past it and you can think about, well, why is she including this stuff in the book? And you can actually see that there might be some interesting stuff going on there, and that it's not just, I want to be shocking, so I'm going to put this spanking scene in here. Part 4. Who needs an editor? Okay, so now we've talked about some of the things that I like about the book, now onto some of the things that I dislike about the book, or that I'm somewhat ambivalent about. So for me, the hardest thing with this book was initially getting into it, and that's something that I talked about recently in my reading vlog. The beginning of the book really didn't enthrall me in the way that beginnings to other books in the series did. The setup with Armand going to the house and David telling him to tell his story just felt kind of forced to me. It didn't feel the way it felt in, say, Interview the Vampire, when you have, you know, Louis having his interview and the build-up and the tension and all that kind of stuff. None of that was there. And so it really took a while to get into the book. Another issue is that the whole book itself is quite long. It's 520 pages, which I think makes it the longest so far, at least, in the series, or one of the longest so far in the series. And I think the book would have helped a lot if it had been edited a bit. You know, Rice does have some really beautiful prose, and I wouldn't want to change them that much, because I think they're beautiful at times, but she does have a tendency to ramble. She does have a tendency to go off on some side point for a while, or just spend a really long time describing something that doesn't really go anywhere. And in a very long book like this, that can be hard to read. It can be a bit of a chore at times, and I did feel that with this book, more so than I think a lot of the other books in the series so far. Now, for those of you who are big fans of the series, you might know this, but Rice famously does not have an editor for her books. And I think it was around the time of either this book or Men Not the Devil when she stopped having editors look at her work. I do think that while I have watched interviews where she's talked about this, she might have some good reasons for this. Ultimately, I do think it is a bad thing for her not to have an editor, because this book, you know, if it was about 100 pages less, probably would be one of the best in the series, because for me, some of the biggest problems were just in terms of this meandering that was going on a lot. So Rice has given a couple of reasons for why she doesn't like people editing her work. One is that she thinks to have an editor go in and, you know, chop things up or make changes or ask that you make changes as the author, she thinks that that undermines the writer's integrity. And then another thing that she thinks is that, well, how could the editor possibly know how to tell my story better than I could, because I'm a writer and they are not. Now, I think the first argument might have some merit, especially given the genre and the themes that Rice deals with in her books. Now, the Vampire Chronicles, as I've said previously, have always had this homoerotic subtext to them, and they've also had this just general sexuality to them. And I can imagine that as a writer working in that area, she probably has had pushback with some of her works for maybe being too explicit. And so if she's coming from that angle as a writer who's perhaps had people say, well, maybe you should brush that over, you should get rid of that stuff. We don't want any of that stuff in here. Maybe that kind of motivates why she thinks that. And there are certainly stories of authors who have had things in their books, like gay characters as lead characters, where people have suggested in the publishing house, well, maybe they should be a side character, or maybe you should change the sexuality of the character. So this stuff does happen. So if she's coming from that angle, I can kind of see where she might be coming from, if editors are, undermining significant aspects of the story. However, the second argument that she makes about, how could the editor know better than me? I don't think that quite works, because the point of an editor isn't to rewrite your book for you, right? The point of an editor is to be a second pair of eyes who can see what you're doing as an author, and they can tell you whether you're communicating the thing that you want to communicate effectively. This reminds me once of a short story that I wrote, and I got my partner to read it, and I thought I conveyed the message quite well. Basically, there was some kind of mystery there, and I thought I'd put in enough clues that if you thought about it for 5 minutes after reading it, you'd be able to work it out. Now, it was really hard for me to tell how good those clues were, because I already knew what the mystery was to be solved. So I needed him as a reader to tell me whether it worked, because I can't do that for myself, because I already know the solution. And so he told me that he didn't quite get it, or at least he didn't get it as quickly as I would have liked. So that made me rethink the story and change it around a bit. And I think an editor can do a similar sort of thing, right, for a writer. They can help you change your story in a way that allows you to communicate what you want to communicate slightly better. And I think that's where Rice goes wrong. She could really do with that kind of editing, because sometimes she just gets bogged down in these religious tangents that go on and go on, to the point where you're not really quite sure what she's going on about anymore. And it does hamper the quality of the book, I think. It does make it a bit of a slog to get through. It does sometimes mar the pacing of the story when you're going off on these tangents. And so it really could have done with some kind of edit. So this is the thing that I think I agree with mostly with people who criticize this book, and probably a lot of the books around this period. It's that they do go on a bit, they do have these tangents, and they really could do with a little bit of editing. Part 5. The Vampire Anne Rice. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about, and I think this might be tied to the point about editing that I just made a little bit, but this is something to do with how the presence of Anne Rice in the Vampire Chronicles books, as they've gone on, seems to be becoming more and more dominant, to the point where it almost feels like Anne Rice is actually in these books herself. And there are moments in the book where characters will say things or act in a certain way or whatever, and you don't see that character anymore. You see Anne Rice making a comment on the series or her thoughts about something. And for me, this is a mixed bag of a thing, because on the one hand, it's kind of interesting when the author is kind of that present in their work that you can tell how they feel about stuff. That's interesting. But on the other hand, when it seems like they are taking over their characters to put their voice through rather than the character's voice, that can be a bad thing because it damages the story. Especially given that these are first-person stories mostly, so you do kind of want the character voice and not the Anne Rice voice. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples of where I think this happens in the book. So the main one is the religious parts of the text. And I mentioned this with Memnoch the Devil. It really seemed to me in that book that the whole Memnoch and his story that he tells to start was very much Rice working out her religious puzzles and questions on the page. And I thought that was really fascinating in that book because it was tied into her world and the existence of vampires and the whole mythology there. I thought it was really ambitious and cool, even if it did sort of take over the start story a little bit there. It was really cool. Now in this book, the religious stuff doesn't play such a strong role because it doesn't dominate, half of the story in the way that it does in Memnoch. But it is still there, with Armand constantly going on these little rants about God and blah blah blah, and his going out into the flames, and then his whole experience. Again, it kind of builds into this stuff. But in this book, it didn't feel as wowing to me as it did in the other one. Maybe because it didn't seem so much tied into the plot as it did in the other one, or tied into the mythology. It just felt like you had these passages where Rice was rambling for a while, and then we get back to the action in Armand. And so that's why it feels like these rambling bits are more Anne Rice than they are Armand. Although, to some extent, they are him because he does have a lot of religious baggage as well. Another example of this is with the way that Rice treats the character of Gabrielle, Lestat's mother. Now, she only appears in this book for like, I don't know, a handful of pages towards the end. And I won't spoil in terms of what happens with her, although nothing particularly substantial. But Rice has said explicitly in interviews that she doesn't really like Gabrielle because Gabrielle doesn't love Lestat. And that's fine, but she also makes it known in this book that for some reason everyone hates Gabrielle. So Armand has this island where vampires can go. It's basically like Nicholas Branson's island, but for vampires. And he talks a little bit about some of the vampires that have been there. Most of them are the big ones that we know of, and one of them is Gabrielle. And he tells us that everyone there hates Gabrielle. And I just felt like, why does everyone hate Gabrielle? There was no like motivation for this point particularly. And then in the scene where she actually turns up, she is just this really heartless, horrible person who shouts at Armand a lot, is really unsympathetic with basically everyone, and yeah, she's just become this really cruel person. And it felt to me like this again is Rice, who doesn't like this character, deciding, okay, well I'm just going to reduce you to being this cruel, horrible creature, rather than actually trying to be consistent with who Gabrielle was from the previous books. Now, yeah, Gabrielle in previous books, she was always somewhat aloof, cold, distant from the start because he made her, and that's a thing that she makes a big deal about in this book. Your maker is a vampire, the one who made you. You're always going to have a bad relationship with them. And so it makes sense that Gabrielle would be a bit weird with Lestat because of that. And it makes sense that she's a bit distant. I mean, she's always been sort of a lone wolf type vampire. She's always gone off on her own. But I always felt like there was more to her than this. And the fact that she does come back for Lestat suggests that she does feel some bond with him, even if she feels compelled to mostly be away from people because she doesn't like people. But what we had with Gabrielle in previous books was something really interesting and complex. And the way she appeared in this book was just very one-dimensional, and it just seemed to be Anne Rice doesn't like this character, so she's going to reduce her to her worst qualities. So this is just another example, I think, of how Rice sometimes puts herself in her books a little bit too much. Now, to some extent, she has always done this. I mean, Interview with the Vampire itself, I mean, she lost her daughter, and we have Claudia the Vampire, and that whole tragic story. And so, even there we do have her putting herself into her work a little bit. But in that case, it didn't come across that way, right? It felt like Louis' story, it felt like he was telling it, and that biographical information is somewhat irrelevant to the story in a way, like anyone could have written that. Whereas in this book, and in Memnoch again, it seems like Rice is becoming a bit too much of a force in her own work, to the point where she just sometimes possesses characters and says, this thing is crap, or, this person, in the case of Gabrielle. And so I do find that somewhat grating sometimes, even if it can be interesting like it was in Memnoch. So it's something that is a bit hit and miss, and it's something that I think as a reader you might not like when you're reading the book, because it does take you a little bit out of Armand's story when you can feel Anne Rice, trying to insert her beliefs about her work, about, about religion, about all kinds of things, and that taking over the characters. Part 6, conclusion. So overall, I do think that The Vampire Armand is a solid entry in the series. I also think that if you like Interview the Vampire, if that's one of your tops in the series, then this one will probably be just as good for you. I think it's very similar to Interview the Vampire. Not just in terms of the setup, you've got an interview again, but just in terms of the focusing on one character and their journey from human to vampire to now, focusing on the deep relationships that they have with other vampires. All of the kind of homoerotic subtext that is in Interview is brought out more explicitly here. All that stuff, it is very similar to that story. It's not so much like the Lestat stories where we usually get more action, we usually get more crazy things going on. Vampire Armand is a much more somber book, although I do think it is a bit more positive than Interview. It's not as tragic, it's not as depressing. Although it's still pretty dark because it's a gothic novel, it's Anne Rice. It's certainly not a happy book, but it does have a somewhat nice, satisfying, somewhat uplifting finish. Okay, that's it for today's video. Please let me know in the comments what you think of The Vampire Armand, As I said, it is one of the more divisive books in the series, so if you have issues with it, I'd love to hear what those issues are with it. And if you enjoy it like I do, or if you really enjoy it even more than I do, also let me know why you think the way you think. It's always good to have discussions with you lot in the comments, so please do that. And also, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel for updates for new videos. But that's it for me now though, so take care everyone, and I will see you all next time.